Tonight, we're going to be talking about sexual identities, gender identities, ways that people can be allies to the 2S LGBTQ plus community. So this is just sort of a basic primer. Again, if you have questions throughout and you're comfortable being recorded, please unmute, speak up. I can't view the chat box while I'm sharing my screen. So somebody will have to sort of shout out to me if there is a chat box question, or to Ally.
I can actually, yeah, I can see the chat box, so we're good.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay, so let's dive right in. So there's our contact information. We can provide it at any point, or you can visit gilbertcenter.ca to get any of our staff contact info and all of our program information. Right, Ally, do you want to start in with part?
Yeah, so hey for everyone. Hi, I'm Ally, and I use they and them pronouns. And so let's talk about how introductions can be super awkward and uncomfortable for trans people sometimes. So there are a few different things that if you're a trans person and you're being introduced to a new person, you have to kind of be a little bit weary of, right? So I just introduced my pronouns to you all. So an example could be if I was introducing my pronouns to someone and they weren't super receptive of using my pronouns. That might be something that might feel unsafe for me. If I was in a group of people and I was with a friend and my friend introduced me to someone else but misgendered me, right? Like this might be super uncomfortable. Like, do I correct the person? Do I let it go? I'm establishing a new relationship with somebody and I've just been misgendered in that relationship, which can make it really uncomfortable to correct that. And it can also create a dynamic where I'm starting off relationships in a way that doesn't feel super comfy for me, right? So introductions can be really uncomfortable for trans folks. It's important that even if you're not trans, you do try to introduce yourself with what your name is and what your pronoun is as well, just to normalize the experience for everyone. So everyone has names, everyone has pronouns. We're going to talk about it a little bit more. Also, if you're going to introduce someone who you know is trans, be careful of outing that person. So we never want to say that someone's trans to somebody else unless we have permission from that person. So always checking in with trans folks to see what situations might feel safe, what other situations might not feel safe. Because for the trans person, like they might be calculating a bunch of different factors, and so it's important to check in. Another note on introductions and how they can feel. I don't know if folks have heard this before, like preferred name and preferred pronoun, like being asked. So it's pretty common. So what I would say is if you are someone and you're trying to ask a trans person's name and pronouns, you wouldn't say preferred name or preferred pronoun. And the reason for that is when you're asking preferred name and preferred pronoun, you're implying that you can also misgender them or call them by a different name, and that is also potentially okay because their name and pronoun is just a preference, right? It's like, do you prefer chocolate or vanilla ice cream? Like either ice cream is okay, but chocolate might be a little bit better. No, not how pronouns work, not how names work. If somebody gives you their name and pronoun, that's what they use. That would be the basic thing that we would need to do in order to start respecting that person.
Yeah, I just want to add that you also, just because a person doesn't identify as trans doesn't mean that they're not struggling with gender. And maybe you can be a safe space for them to try out a pronoun that they're not quite comfortable using in everyday settings. So you can set the tone by, sort of noting that you're potentially a safer person to try that on with. But just because you share your pronoun in an intro doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is going to feel safe coming out to you or trying on different aspects of their gender, and gender has a ton of aspects, as we will come to see. So, righty.
All right, so here are some pronoun options. These are the most common ones. However, it's not an exhaustive list. There are tons of different pronouns. These are just the most common ones in the English language. So we have he, him, his, That would be typically used by someone who identifies as a man, but it's not exclusive to men. She, her, hers, again, typically used by someone who might identify as a woman, not exclusive to women though. Like you might be non-binary or some sort of trans and use those pronouns, and that's okay too. They, them, theirs, again, not exclusive to non-binary folk, but non-binary folk seem to prefer those pronouns. There's also something called neopronouns, which can be anything and everything. Some common ones are sie, them, their. In my youth group, there are folks that use completely different words that aren't necessarily pronouns, but they use them as pronouns. So like tree, tree, and trees, box, box, and boxes. Those are all examples of neopronouns. The important thing to note is that we just want to try to use whatever language the person has given us to use. So even if we're not used to it or if it feels a little funny to us, that doesn't mean we can't start to try to use that person's pronouns the way that they want them to be used. And somebody also might mix and match pronouns. So like someone might use, or for me, for an example, I'll take he, him, and his pronouns. And I'll also take they, them, and theirs. Neither one of them I would consider misgendering. She, her, hers, definitely a misgendering. And so sometimes folks might want you to mix pronouns when you're referring to them. That also works. You might need to do some checking in around how that person might want it to be mixed because that might be different for different people. But yeah, when in doubt, ask the person some clarifying questions around how they feel the most comfy having their pronouns used and try to use whatever language they have given you.
I want to address too, sort of they, them, theirs as a default if you're unsure of somebody's pronoun. Allie, how do you feel about that?
I feel as though it is potentially a fine thing to do at first, but once you have learned what that person's pronouns are, we need to start using the pronouns that they've asked for.
Absolutely, I agree. I also want to add that some people actually do use it as a pronoun. That is a sort of slippery slope. Please don't ever use that term for someone unless they have specifically identified that that is how they would like to be addressed. So again, just to reiterate, Allie, take the lead of the person you're talking to. It's not a difficult discussion to have. It takes 2 seconds just to say, hey, my name's Evan. I use he, him pronouns. What pronouns do you use?
I also have a chat question, and I think that it's a really good one. So what pronouns are used when speaking in a language that genders they, them pronoun or any person, like French or Italian or Spanish would be good examples of this. So there are actually resource guides online around how to create gender neutral language after like very gendered language. I'm definitely not an expert on French speaking. I can barely even speak French myself, but those language guides do exist. There's one on the 519 website. So if you wanted to go and check that out, like it's called Creating Authentic Spaces and it's available in French and it goes over the French language and how we can make those adjustments for gender nonconforming people.
Okay, my screen is not advancing.
Of course.
There we go.
All right. So a little bit about today. We don't have a ton of time, so we are probably not even going to do all of the slides, and that's okay. There's a lot to learn. We're not going to cover everything. We have about an hour today, and we're not going to leave it being perfect experts on queer and trans stuff. It's just not possible, right? The information might be overwhelming or challenging. That is also okay. Take time for yourself. If folks need to turn their camera off or walk away, that is totally fine too. Do whatever you need to do in this space. We are going to ask you for a willingness to engage and learn, and hopefully the space can remain as respectful as possible. We also are going to create a brave space and not a safe space. So what I mean by that is I want folks to feel safe and comfortable enough to ask their questions, even if they don't have the right words for those questions, right? So if you ask something and it feels super messy, that's okay. I might suggest more inclusive language. That's not personal. That's just my job. Like, that's what Evan and I are here for. And so totally not personal. We really want folks to be able to be brave and ask the questions that they need to ask, even if the language is problematic. So some of the material that we're talking about, especially for folks who have experience with this, it might be challenging. Again, do what you need to do, turn your cameras off, walk away, do some meditation, like whatever works for you. Sounds good. We are all adults here, so take care of yourselves as you need to. And if anyone else needs anything to feel safe in the space, recognizing that this is being recorded, so if you don't want to say it out loud, that is fine. You can type it in the chat, and I will either read it if you want that, or just take note of it. All right. So why does it matter? So this is a trans health study done in Simcoe, Muskoka, so our region, in 2017. So it marks how trans folks have experienced depression within our region. There's like 4. I think we can put them all up. That's fine.
Okay.
It doesn't need to be a dramatic revealing. All right. So trans folks in Simcoe, Muskoka, 13% experience physical assault in the street. So 13% of our community, they walk outside, they experience physical assault. 46%, so about 50-50 chance, if you live in Simcoe, Muskoka and you're trans, you're going to experience verbal harassment in the streets. Again, about a 50-50 shot that if you are trans living in Simcoe, Muskoka, you feel outright unsafe living in our community. And 63%, so more than half of trans folks living in Simcoe, are uncomfortable reporting abuse to authorities. And that doesn't even just mean police. That can be any authority. So if it's a youth, that might be parents, that might be like a respected teacher. It really could be any sort of authority figure that has the capability to intervene in that abuse, right? So 63% of trans folks in our community are feeling unsafe to do that very simple thing that we need folks, especially young people, to be able to do. So this is the healthcare one. This is I think even more jarring. So 16% of trans folks in our region avoided calling 911 when needed. So that's about 20% of trans folks in an emergency situation where they were needing 911 support did not call 911. 33% avoided the local emergency department, and 54% avoided healthcare when needed. And this is super important because this adds to long-term health outcomes of our entire community, right? So for me, for an example, I hit my head a few years ago. I got a brain injury, and I actually did it almost directly outside of a hospital. I did not go into that hospital. I went home, right? And the reason why I went home was because I was worried that I would pass out, not be able to advocate for my gender identity, and get misgendered, right? So the fear of getting misgendered and being mistreated in the hospital took precedence and priority over my healthcare. And I eventually obviously did need to go to a hospital, but I went weeks later when that healthcare could have been immediate, right? So that is a huge stat, and it adds to long-term health outcomes because we know that sometimes with health things, an anthill can become a mountain if you don't go to the doctor, right? There's no early detection if 54% of our community are avoiding healthcare entirely when they need it.
Sorry, I just want to add that that includes really minor things that you wouldn't always think about, things like dental care and vision care, just because maybe your provider is asking the wrong questions on the form. They're not providing space for any gender diversity, and it just gets exhausting explaining gender and who you are and why you deserve healthcare, and it's not always cool. So
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of it directly translates to like how doctors treat trans folks when we do get healthcare, and whether that be dentist or eye doctor or any sort of doctor. It can be a huge challenge to advocate for yourself if you're a trans person and you're just trying to get healthcare. For example, my doctor a few months ago had to send me for an ultrasound, right? And wrote she her pronouns in the ultrasound form. I asked her to change it, and she was like, no, because if I don't write she her pronouns, then the people who do the ultrasound won't know what genitals you have. Which was super weird because I was not getting my genitals in the ultrasound. Like, it had nothing to do with what I was going for. But my doctor felt it was important and felt as though misgendering me was the only way to get that information across, right? So, and my doctor is quite good when it comes to trans stuff in correlation to like other doctors. And so if this is what my doctor, who's quite good and is open to learning, is doing, and that's her perception, then like think of what the entire medical community can feel like for a trans person. So Bill C-16, this bill passed in 2017, and this was when trans people got human rights in Ontario. I think a lot of folks are a little bit jarred by this, feel as though it might have should have happened sooner, but we have only had human rights under like in Ontario as trans folks for about 4 years. So, and there was a lot of controversy around this bill. So, this is in result of a study that the Ontario government did back in 2015, where 96% of trans folks had heard that they were not normal. 73% had been made fun of for being trans. 20% had been physically or sexually assaulted for being trans. 13% were fired for being trans, while another 15% on top of that had been fired from a job but weren't given an indication as to why. And 10% of trans emergency room patients had reported having care stopped or denied. So, up until 2017, if you were trans and you went to the emergency department and the doctor didn't want to treat you because you were a trans person, it was perfectly legal to send you away because trans people did not have human rights in Ontario. So to just think of like how recent this was and how much pushback this bill got, a lot of folks were very angry about this bill because they felt like it was an infringement on their freedom of speech, where no one is proposing that anyone goes to jail for misgendering a trans person in this bill. It was a ridiculous argument, but it like still gained a ton of controversy. All right, concepts and language. These should be pretty familiar. Sex, gender identity, gender expression, attraction. So sex is your body parts. Those are the genitals that you have. It may or may not be what genitals you were assigned at birth, depending on however you think of that. If they're different now, that can be a complicated conversation for trans folks, but essentially it could be reduced to what genitals you have. Gender identity, that is the gender you identify as. That is how we view and experience our own gender and how we relate to the world. Gender expression is, I think the best way to explain this is that it's a performance, right? So we wake up in the morning, we choose how our hair is going to look, maybe less so during COVID. We pick what clothes we're going to put on for that day. Our mannerisms are a choice. The words that we choose to use are a choice. All of this makes up our gender expression, and it has to do with the way that we express our potential gender identity to the world. This is not a very good indication of what someone's gender identity might be, because we know that sometimes people are in the closet, right? And sometimes they don't feel safe coming out. Sometimes, if you're a trans youth, or if you're a senior and you don't have the ability to buy your own clothing, and someone else is buying your clothing for you, they might not be picking out the clothing that feels good for you in your gender identity, right? And you might not have a choice in that. And so we can't always just look at someone and decide what their gender is. We need to ask questions about that, if it's appropriate. Sometimes it's not. You don't need to know the gender of complete strangers. And attraction. So attraction is just who you're attracted to, right? And that could be sexual attraction, that could be romantic attraction. Um, yeah, it could even be platonic attraction, like whoever you're attracted to.
So a good way to be an ally is to understand that everybody, you can be heterosexual, you can be cisgender, and we'll touch on the word cisgender in a little bit. But you all have gender identities, you all have gender expressions, you all have sex, you all use pronouns. It's just that most people are not forced to really confront those in their own lives. I've found in a lot of different webinars or just in-person sessions, if you ask people to identify their pronouns, some people really need a minute to sit and think, like, what is a pronoun, and why have I not thought about this? So it's not exclusive to trans identities. It's not exclusive to queer identities. These are things that everyone has. You all express your gender in different ways, regardless of your identity and how you identify. So yeah, it's universal things that are often only applied to queer bodies, and we just sort of want to expand that.
Yeah, so dysphoria is a state of unease or dissatisfaction. This is not a requirement for being trans, but it is a helpful thing to know about when it comes to trans people. So trans folks may or may not have dysphoria. It doesn't make it that they're like more or less valid as a trans person, but somebody who is trans might feel uncomfortable with their body. They might have a feeling of dissatisfaction with their body or with their voice, or the fact that they can't grow facial hair, or the fact that they do grow facial hair. All of those things can cause dysphoria. There's also a term called gender euphoria, which is kind of the flip side of that. That means like if you were to be gendered correctly, that would make you really happy. And that's also a valid experience of trans people. So not all trans folks get dysphoria. Some folks just get euphoria, and that is also super okay.
Also, there's a term called perceived gender, which often has nothing to do with how a person actually identifies. It's how somebody outside of you views your gender. And for some, that is the real source of dysphoria. It's that people don't see them as the gender that they are. And so, yeah, that's just a term to keep in mind. Perceived gender is not always the same as actual gender identity or even the performance of their gender.
All right, so transitioning may be particularly unique for non-binary youth. Really, I can change the word youth on this slide and just write non-binary people, because this kind of applies to everyone. So there's three main types of the ways in which we might transition. The most important one, and the one that we need to identify a trans person, is social transition. So if somebody tells you they're trans, they're trans. So social transition can be done by informing people of your gender identity, changing your name and pronouns, switching gendered spaces that you use, or maybe changing gender expression. Not always the case for non-binary folks, and a non-binary person or a trans person doesn't have to choose every single one of these. Like, it's not a must-get shopping list. As soon as someone decides that they're trans or non-binary and relays that information, that's all we need. They don't need to do anything else, right? So if somebody comes out as trans and never changes their name or pronouns, never changes the spaces that they occupy, they're still just as trans as anybody else. There's also physical transition. So there are some low cost ways to do that, like haircuts, and those sorts of things, changing the way that you dress, using binders and packers, or tucking. Like, all of those are part of a physical transition. And also, of course, hormones, surgeries, like the medicalized process of this. And then there's also a legal transition, and this is mainly just changing your paperwork in order to have it be more valid of your gender identity. This can be a huge just like barrier for folks, because these things cost money. And so I think it costs around like $130 or so to get your name changed in Ontario. And so that is a huge barrier for a lot of trans folks. A lot of folks never change their legal name because of these reasons. Some folks don't have up-to-date records because they are immigrants, right? And so they actually can't get their names changed. And so there's lots of different reasons why this category in particular might be really inaccessible, but it's also very important. I think that I read a study that showed that it can decrease symptoms of suicidality in a trans youth by around 80% to just have one piece of documentation that fits their gender identity. So, this huge category that can do so much to improve the well being of our community has a cost value to it that is inaccessible to our community, right? So I've been throwing out the word non-binary a whole lot, but I haven't defined it. So this is the gender binary. So if we think of man and woman on two sides, so if we're going to get really problematic here for just 1 second and like stereotype men. So if we're going to stereotype men, we're going to basically think of like someone who's not sensitive at all, someone who grows facial hair, they never cry, if they're chopping wood in the forest. I don't know. I just described a lumberjack. Think of a lumberjack. So, and a woman would be like docile, takes care of children, is super sensitive, cries a lot, and I'm basically going to describe Barbie if I keep going, right? So like this is the gender binary system. And they work in opposition with each other. So man is on one side, like big burly lumberjack, Barbie's on the other side, and they are just polar opposites. A non-binary person is someone who looks at the system and goes, nah, not for me. Like it doesn't fit for how I view my gender. I can't make sense of it within my own identity. This binary system just doesn't work, right? So non-binary can mean a lot of different things. We don't just have one experience. The only thing collective that non-binary folks will feel is that this gender binary doesn't fit for them. And it's also important to note that like society is becoming more accepting of non-binary and trans folks. That is true. There's a lot of challenges, but more non-binary people are coming out for that reason, and also for the reason that like the gender binary has become even more extreme in the last like 50 years, right? So we are making it so that less people kind of feel like they fit into this category completely, right? Like through marketing around like Barbie and media, all of these things have kind of made the gender identity kind of out here and push against each other, and it also pushes people out of it, and so that creates more gender diverse people because the box lines of how we're defining gender become more rigid. As Evan mentioned, everybody's got a sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression. In order to locate other folks and understand how other folks experience that, we need to locate ourselves. So we have a little gender spectrum here. We should be able to kind of work around it to like see where we fit on it, but I'm going to give mine as an example so that folks can just see.
So just before we continue, sorry,
Yeah.
I find that a lot of people don't understand the term cisgender. So maybe let's address that before we move on.
Yeah.
Cisgender is literally just someone who was born and identified, well, assigned a gender based on genitalia, and somebody who is comfortable remaining as that gender. It is literally the opposite of trans. So trans versus cis. Everybody has a gender. Well, not everybody. We'll get into that too. But so it's just the majority of people are cisgender. So that just means that you're comfortable with the gender that was assigned to you when you were born.
All right, spectrum map. So sex. So we have right now male on one side, female on one side, intersex kind of in the middle. This is not a perfect like rendition of how it works. Like intersex isn't really in the middle of male and female. And intersex means anyone whose external reproductive organs, internal, no, yeah, external reproductive organs, internal reproductive organs, or hormones are different from what we would expect of a typical like penis or vagina scenario, right? So anyone who has like weird hormones, not weird, sorry, anyone who has different hormones than what would be like typical of a doctor, anyone who has external genitalia that is a little bit different from what we would be used to seeing, or internal. So not everybody knows that they are intersex, if they're intersex or not. I currently have not had an intersex test, so I'm not sure if I'm intersex. And so, yeah, it's just important to recognize that like we don't know how, like, if people are intersex or not. It is as common as folks who with red hair. So if you've ever met a person with red hair, you've also probably met an intersex person. And that is low estimations because, as mentioned, we don't all get hormone tests to see if we're intersex. And historically, when we've done that for sports, like made that mandatory for folks who are playing sports, we find out that there's actually a lot more intersex people than we think that there is. So a lot of folks are actually getting flagged as intersex when we do that mandatory testing. So it's actually quite more common than we think that it is. Gender identity, we've kind of defined all of these. The only one that's different here is, again, something that Evan mentioned, no gender. So if you are someone who doesn't have a gender, that literally just means that gender is not something that you identify with at all. This might fall under a non-binary umbrella. It may not. It really depends on how the person identifies that for themselves.
Another term for that is also agender, which is a part of the one of the A's in our acronym, the 2S LGBTQ plus. A lot of people do I, A, Q, Q, lots of different letters, but agender falls under one of those.
Gender expression, we kind of get, the word androgynous is not my favorite, but just any word that represents kind of a mix between masculine and feminine could really be plugged into there. Sexual orientation, asexual, we haven't necessarily talked about that yet. So an asexual person is somebody who doesn't have a desire to engage in sex. It doesn't mean that they don't engage in sex. It just means that they don't necessarily have a desire, or they don't have a very strong desire. So some asexual people do have some interest in sex, but not a lot of interest in sex. Some people who are asexual might have a lot of interest in sex if they get to know the person a lot first, right? Which I think is a more common kind of human experience that folks don't really place under like the asexual umbrella, but it still does count. Like it's called demisexual. So if you are a person that needs to experience an emotional connection with someone before feeling a sexual connection with that person, then you might be demisexual. And then sexual behavior. So yeah, this is a little bit more simple. So either you have had sex with folks who are the same gender as you, other genders, or you haven't had sex at all, or many genders. All right, so I'm gonna map myself on here so that we can get an example. So when I was born, I came out, the doctors said, it's a girl. I grew up and I was like, no, it is absolutely not. So I identify as non-binary. I feel as though I do have a gender. I connect with the experience of gender, but it's not, it's just not a man-woman sort of experience. My gender expression can be all over the place. It has really changed during different times of my life. I have femme clothes, I have masculine clothes, and I pick between whatever I feel comfy wearing. Sexual orientation. This one's a little bit weird for me, right? Because I identify as a non-binary person. My star is tilted towards same gender. Does that mean I'm only attracted to non-binary people? No, that's ridiculous, right? And so I put it there because when I'm in relationships with folks, that is typically the space that my relationships take up in the world. So I'm often read as a queer couple, like if I were walking around with partners, right? And so it's kind of leaning towards there, but this one's a little bit loaded for me. It doesn't quite make sense with my experience, but that's also okay. This is just an example. And also sexual behavior, many genders, and there's also a bunch of different reasons why someone's sexual behavior and their sexual orientation might be different. So if someone is a queer woman, for example, and they're engaging in sex work, and all of their clients that they're working with are men, then they are probably having sex with a lot of men, right? But they're not necessarily attracted to men. And so sexual behavior and sexual orientation, they don't always have to line up. Even if someone is like exploring if they might be queer or not, they might have sex with many different genders, but still land in a heterosexual sort of space, and that's okay too. And it's a lightning bolt, so that's fun. If we're unsure about someone's identity, the purpose of this slide is basically just if you are a person and you don't want to misgender a stranger, don't gender the stranger. So here are some ways that we could not do that using words like gender neutral words, police officer, instead of mom and dad, parent or guardian, brother, son, sister, daughter. We can do child or siblings, Mr., Mrs., Miss. The abbreviation for that for a gender neutral person would be mix, MX. So yeah, that's a good one to use if you're not sure about the gender of the person that you are communicating with, or if they're a non-binary person. Here are some more examples. Hey guys, hey team. All of those things can work. Hey guys, I hear a lot that folks are like, well, I use that as a gender neutral word. That's cool. I do too, for sure. But I'm not going to use it if somebody has told me that they don't feel comfortable with it, right? So I'm always going to check in before I'm using words like hey guys, because I recognize that like if I'm saying hey guys to a bunch of trans women, they might not like that so much, right? So I'm going to check in. I'm going to make sure that that language is okay. I'm going to make sure that it feels good for everybody. And then once I get that go ahead, everybody's my gender neutral bro, right? You just need to make sure that you get that consent. So ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, stuff like that works. Separating boys on the left, girls on the right, we can just do team 1 or team 2, black shirts, other types of shirts, like different ways to organize people that isn't gender. And also, how can I help you, ma'am? I have learned throughout my travels that you should just never call anyone ma'am. Like, no one likes it. Everyone hates it. Doesn't matter what your gender is. If you call someone ma'am, they're not happy with you. So we can just throw that one out. Yeah. So understanding homophobia and transphobia in society, there are 3 different ways in which this kind of operates. So there's assumptions of heteronormativity and people not being trans. So the assumption is when people look at me, they go, oh, that must be a cis woman, right? Even though I look super gender bendy and I'm like very non-binary, it does not matter. I am always read as not my gender, right? There's also the belief that being not trans or straight is better or more valid. So we constantly hear, oh, that kid was too young to know what their gender identity is if they're trans. But no one ever says that to a kid that's not trans, right? So we have that assumption that being trans is not as good or being queer is not as good. There's also an irrational fear of hatred towards trans people and gay people, right? There's the whole, oh, we can't let trans folks use the proper bathroom spaces because they're going to go attack people in the bathrooms, when there's no data, no study like that. That idea is not rooted in reality at all. But we still have that fear because there's a deep-seated hatred of trans people in our society. So this is how it works on the individual. So if you're a trans person, you might be experiencing actual homophobia or transphobia. You might have perceived homophobia and transphobia, and that might even be the anticipation of homophobia or transphobia. So if I'm with someone who misgenders me a lot, and I might just be waiting for them to misgender me, right? Like I might not be hearing to anything that they're saying. I might just be waiting for that to happen. That is the anticipation and expectation of transphobia, and it is exhausting, right? There's also internalized queer and transphobia. So when we've taken it from society and gone, you're right, I'm not as good because I'm queer or trans, that becomes internalized oppression, and that can be really sticky to try and work around.
Yeah. Also, all three of them are really interwoven in pretty deep ways. So to come back to the example of Ally not going to the hospital, probably at the time it was a perceived notion of they're going to treat me poorly, but chances are it was based on actual past experiences with the healthcare system. And I'm not going to speak for Ally in this sense, but internalized, a lot of people could say, you know, I'm not going to get the care I deserve. I probably don't deserve to take this space away from somebody else who needs it. You know, throughout our lives, there's a lot of stuff thrown at us that creates that internalized homophobia. It doesn't mean that you actively hate yourself. It's a really private thing. And it's not just from self-hatred, it's from other people hating you and you taking those messages and thinking, they must be right. So many people have said this, it must be true. So a lot of people don't feel that they deserve to have healthcare, to be treated well in mental health systems, things like that. So that prevents a lot of reaching out for support, medical and otherwise. All right, I'm going to hop in here. Seniors are my sort of niche. So what a lot of people don't understand about queer and trans, I'm gonna shorten 2S LGBTQ+ to queer and trans for these purposes. A lot of them came out during a time when it was literally criminal to be homosexual. You could be arrested, you could be put in jail. Often newspapers would publish names of people who were found out to be homosexual or trans. So there was a real culture of fear around being queer or trans, and that really shaped their lives. A lot of them are still not comfortable being out of the closet. When they are out of the closet, they often partner quickly and sort of hermit themselves. They isolate themselves from other community. Ageism is rampant in queer and trans spaces as well as the rest of the world, but queer and trans communities are not exempt from that. So it has resulted in a lack of safe spaces and supports for seniors. Many don't have children or have lost family and friends throughout their coming out process. And it really makes the aging process difficult to navigate without those close supports, without having to, what a lot of people don't understand is that coming out is not a one-time thing. Coming out is something that gets repeated throughout your life. So a senior is still going to be coming out at the age of 65, 75 if they have a new doctor, if they you know, have new coworkers. I mean, people are working well into their 60s, even 70s at this point. So often they need assistance in navigating systems and social interactions, things like that. And there has been a distinct lack of representation in the media and society in general throughout the decades, which has left them feeling worthless, invisible, and really creates increased mental health challenges. So, for example, things like drug and alcohol addiction is higher amongst queer and trans people, including seniors, because of that isolation. There's social isolation, there's physical isolation. And it just creates a really difficult scenario. And we find that when people do reach out, they really, really rely on community. So that's just a little sort of snapshot of what it's like to be a queer trans senior. Seniors now are identified as 55 plus, which a lot of them don't actually identify as seniors because that seems to be creeping down. It used to be around 65 that a senior was considered a senior. So we also use the term older adults just to be more inclusive of people who don't really identify as seniors. And I find that a lot of people, even well into their 70s, don't feel old yet. So older adults is taking over.
So microaggressions, real quick. This has a lot to do with the ways in which homophobia and transphobia can like really hurt for a person who is trans or queer. So queer and trans folks and non-binary folks are not automatically read how we identify. We are subject to constant misgendering. We are explicitly not included in sports, and for no good reason. The biggest factor in sports performance is actually when your birthday is. Most pro athletes have early birthdays January, February, March, and the reason for that is when you are a youth and you are doing sports. If you have an early birthday, you are sometimes a year worth like ahead of development than some of your peers, right? So you already are more developed. You will likely get more attention from coaches, from other folks because you're more developed, and you will grow up to be a much better athlete. So that is actually the biggest indication of, I guess, like advantage when it comes to sports is birthdays. It is not gender. As much as our society would like for it to be gender, it is absolutely not. So we don't ban people who are born in January from taking part in sports because they have an advantage. So we shouldn't do the same for trans people. A lot of the times folks will point to Fallon Fox and say, well, this trans person had a good sporting career, and so therefore we should ban all trans people. No, one example of a good athlete from our community does not mean that we automatically should all just get thrown out. If that was the case, we should also throw out cis men, right? Like we don't do that for other populations, and so we should not also do that for trans folks. It is transphobia. We are omitted from legal studies and documentation. People tell us our pronouns are not correct. People with they, them pronouns get this all the time. And the way that microaggressions work, and I'm also trying to talk really quick and be mindful of time. So the way that microaggressions work is if somebody steps on your foot and they didn't mean to step on your foot, it probably will still hurt, right? It'll hurt less than if someone intentionally slammed down on your foot, right? Um, but it'll still hurt. And if that person who accidentally stepped on your foot just apologizes real quick and moves on, you probably won't remember having your foot stepped on, right? Like it won't be an event in your day. But if the person's a jerk to you and storms off, you'll probably remember it. This is how microaggressions work. So if you misgender a trans person and make a scene about it, that trans person will remember that you misgendered them a lot more than if you just say, oh, sorry, and correct yourself and move on. So that is kind of the way that microaggressions work. And if we go back to the foot stepping analogy, if you get your foot stomped on 100 times in a day, you're going to be super aware of your foot and you might snap at the next person who steps on your foot, right? And that would be a logical reaction and that would make a lot of sense. But to that one person who stepped on your foot and you're snapping at them, it might not feel logical. So if you were to ever misgender a trans person and it seems like their emotional reaction is up here, recognize that they probably got misgendered a bunch of times that day. And that from their point of reference, that reaction does make sense and is rational, right? So just be there. You might even be that safe space where that person can let off those emotions too. And so that actually might be a good thing. Or it might not be. You might be being a jerk. But if you're not being a jerk, it might be a good thing, right?
Also, some really common microaggressions are you don't look blank. So you don't look trans or you don't look gay. Well, what does that even mean? Or wow, but you would be such a pretty woman, or you'd be such a handsome man if you just, people making suggestions about how you should live your life, how you should present your gender, on how to be queer properly. big microaggressions.
Yeah, leading on to just aggressions.
Oh, we're stalled again.
Oh no. It's okay. We might want to like flip to the end and do questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
This is a big one though. If a trans person uses a space, they might just have to use that space. Like I'm not gonna, if I really have to pee, like I'm not gonna make sure that the bathroom matches with my gender. I just have to pee, right?
perfect. So let's talk about allyship and ways that you can be more inclusive, ways that you can be more helpful, ways that you can be safer places for queer and trans folk to go. So there's a little thing: stand in front, stand beside, stand behind. Stand in front of someone who's being mocked, verbally assaulted, or otherwise facing harm or abuse. Do your best to de-escalate situations, but use caution when contacting police or other authorities on their behalf. A lot of queer and trans folk have had issues with authorities or police and are not comfortable around them. So if you're able to, check in with that person before you do contact authorities. But being that physical barrier is often what is needed to stop somebody going off on a verbal tirade or trying to physically attack someone. Stand beside someone to support them, listen to them, share in their experiences. Many fear queer and especially trans bodies, and physical proximity can show support, often without words. Don't keep your distance. Obviously, don't non-consensually be all over them. Touch with consent, but just that closeness is pretty important to a lot of people. And stand behind someone when they're sharing personal experiences. Older queer and trans voices are often erased, as are youth and sort of communities in general. We need to hear directly from community. Know that populations know what's best for them. Queer and trans folk have done a lot of introspective thinking, and there's a lot of knowledge that comes from that. So, they know what is best for them. Raise their voices, center their voices, support them where you can.
So these are some ways to support LGBT youth, but also a lot of these can be applied to just queer and trans folks, right? So compassion and boundaries are good. We never want to out people without their permission. Be trauma informed. A lot of folks in our community have trauma, and if they don't have trauma, sometimes just living your life as a trans person can cause trauma. And so folks have the right to be free of discrimination and harassment, receive respectable health care, use bathrooms or change rooms they feel most appropriate for them, dress in ways that feel right and safe, and also don't use anybody's dead name. And by dead name, I mean any name that they no longer go by, that would be referred to as a dead name within the trans community. It is super harmful to bring that up. I know for me, even if I hear my dead name in passing, if somebody else is saying it and it's not directed at me, I have a visceral response. Like I have moved away from people who are like on the phone with someone with my dead name before. And so that's how powerful it can be for folks. So we never want to call folks that. We also want to ask who you're allowed to share their gender identity or sexual orientation with and who you're not, and that should be an ongoing conversation because that often changes, and representation is super important. So we always want to make folks feel seen and make folks feel as though they belong in our community, and you don't need to be part of our community to give that representation. So having queer like books around, or having those sorts of like visual representations that like folks who are trans or queer are welcome in this space can be really important. Also, using gender neutral washrooms, even if you're not trans, can be really important. So, what I mean by that is lots of bullying happens in gender neutral washrooms. So, we have this idea that trans people are predators trying to get into other people's washrooms, when really trans folks are the ones who are actually being attacked in washrooms. So, buddy system for gender neutral washrooms can be really important. If you're a cis person, go into that washroom as long as you're not taking up too much space. If there's not a huge line, if you're able, go into that washroom, make sure folks are okay. Like, be ready to be that ally. That is a space where folks need allies, right? Learn practical information about binding can also help, like chest binding can also help if you're supporting a trans person. Making sure that they're being safe with binding can be super great. So not binding for more than 8 hours, making sure you have a binder that fits you right, those sorts of things. Be ready to have hard conversations. This can be really challenging. We're all raised in this context where trans and queer people are erased. We all have that socialization, even queer and trans people. And so we need to have hard conversations, and we need to be ready to let go a lot of our bias to show good allyship to queer and trans folks, if that makes sense. Make homophobic and transphobic language unacceptable in your spaces or around you. That could be very powerful. And it can be as simple as, if somebody says something's gay and it's not actually gay, you make that correction, right? That can signify that you're a safe person and that you're not going to allow that language around you, which is super cool. Be ready to examine and let go of your own views of gender. This might even apply to how you fit your gender or how you see gender in other folks. And consent is always important. And that's something we've been talking about throughout. Some resources and next steps. The Family and Youth Program right now, in response to COVID-19, is operating via Discord. If folks have a youth that they think might benefit from getting access to that Discord server, please feel free to send me a text and I will send a link to get on there. I do like to verify whoever has the link because it's a group full of children. So we have to be safe about that. So feel free, send me a text. The link isn't public, but it can absolutely be accessible. This is when we typically would run groups not in COVID. So we have Aurelia, Midland, Bradford groups, as well as Barrie groups. We have a younger one as well as an older one. But right now, again, we're operating over Discord. It's a very cool space. We have about 130 kids in there right now. So super popular, super well used. If folks have anyone that could benefit.
All right, and for seniors, unfortunately, I didn't do a slide for our programs. Currently, everything is online. We have 2 meetings every week. Wednesday evenings, we have Older and Bolder. Friday afternoons, we have coffee and chat. We also have monthly bingo games. We do trivia nights. We do educational webinars. So there's lots going on. And we actually have partnered with agencies as far north as Sudbury. So we have a sort of central and northern Ontario network of seniors, 2S LGBTQ plus seniors who have come together, and we're working on creating a larger community. So that's pretty cool. Again, you can go to gilbertcenter.ca for any of our programming info and to connect with any of our staff. I didn't add my thing to that, but again, you can find me on our website.